A Huimiushla, a Horda, a Gaelov, Stocha. The fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. Agus Maireann and Fearshig leis an ráta son. While Ireland holds these graves, Ireland, unfree, shall never be at peace. Dógach an tachtrach son ling, nís móna céad bliain ó hin, agus is álaigh gur fíoriad na focail son fós anú. Cahamid bheithe mon gníomh inú, go bríomhar in aigen asa, tá an ein fós le baint amach. A corda fáilte róibh chuige amachtaí an lé, chun tús a corla leis an amach. Is tócha írim oribh, clí leis an scar associalte, gabhór or gabhór sláinte. Corda ha mid bailithe sa chun amós spáint de Bert óglaigh mór cogan na síirse sa tíorsa ardmhéar na carach Traolach Machsína agus Seosamh Murchú, Joe Murphy, an Bertacha a bhór bás stal gocaris son síirse na tíre agus há cortha sa rélig sa. Martús is malam íar Shirley le de hol chun padar beag rá le hol.
Orla you orla, you lay for down, you the padaria, your legs are the holler and talon. Mine orla, oh, you're doing it all, I'll be smart to a fear. Is knowledge in go obsession.
Goramaha go Shirley, Anish. Beg no maid Cunish a going a stalker, their son na Hoglig, le Bordal. Now, I think we have wreaths to lay on both graves. On the grave, so could I invite people to come forward, please? Dinner and ye dinner, Stocha. And so oig Traolach Machsína, agus oig Seosamh Murchú a hoes. Dos and so lads. Goramaha give a corda. Anish, chun aish le céin fó, agus cader a shrid na Hoglig son, Irmer Anton Bernach, dinner den grúpa, the Cork Brigade Reenactment Group, chun forrógra na Phoblachta a lei of amach díomh. Goramaha give.
Public na Héireann. The provisional government of the Irish Republic to the Irish people. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, signed on behalf of the provisional government. Thomas J. Clark, Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pearce, Eamon Cant, James Connolly, and Joseph Plunkett.
Go to Anton. Anisha Chorda, gan mil irmeir more the feet, con Orad and Leia Hort. Mary.
Comóradh. Volunteer turns Max Sweeney, Traolach Mac Subman, is a towering figure in the battle for Irish independence and in the promotion of Irish culture. Blessed with an abundance of talents and abilities, he ploughed these gifts into building the Irish military defence forces and advancing Irish nationalism and our cultural activities. The kind-hearted nature of Terry, as he was affectionately known, was clearly evident in his countenance. I've only seen photographs of him, but immediately you can see the shining honesty that is indelibly written in his face as it is recorded in his actions. Traolach was one of 8 children, 7 survived, born to Mary and John McSweeney. He was born in 23 North Main Street on the 28th of March in 1879. His parents inculcated a love of nationalism and their country in their children. They themselves were nationalistic and devout Catholics. His father started a little business, snuff and tobacco business in Cork. Unfortunately, the venture failed. He then emigrated to Australia to earn a living to send support back to his family, but sadly he died in 1895. Traolach attended the North Monastery. He was an exemplary student there, and there he met the measc McCurtain. They became friends, and later they became trusted comrades in arms. Traolach left school and got full-time employment to support his family, though he continued his education. He'd go to bed at 8 p.m. at night, and then he'd rise at 2 a.m., study and go to work. He obtained a degree in mental and moral science in 1905. In 1904 his mother died, and this really had a deep effect on him. He helped form the Celtic Literary Society around 1901. He was also a member of the Gaelic League, which promoted Irish language and culture. Along with the GAA, these endeavours imbibed a sense of pride and confidence in our people and strengthened their character. Among his many projects, he formed the Irish Industrial Development Association, which was organised specially to promote Irish industry. They started Irish industries and they encouraged people to buy Irish goods. The organisation became so strong it spread to Dublin. His sister Mary gave an account, in giving her account to the American Congress on conditions in Ireland in 1920, said, "The fact that we have a consul here and in almost every European country in Europe against the wishes of England is down to my brother's works and his comrades." They were responsible for that success. Edward Carson formed and armed the Ulster Volunteers in 1912. He also received $2 million from England for his propaganda. Terence and measc McCurtain formed the Cork branch of the Irish Volunteers in December 1913. Terence then travelled throughout Cork, recruiting members and trying to raise funds for arms. Within a year, 2,000 enlisted. Redmond's recruiting for the British in World War I split the volunteers, and only 50 remained with measc and Terence. They set about rebuilding, and indeed by 1916 had enlisted 1,000. Countermanding orders issued during Easter week caused confusion in Cork. Traolach's non-involvement in the Easter Rising always weighed very heavily on him up until his death. Following the Rising, Traolach and others were arrested and deported from Ireland and held in England, in Wakefield Prison. The released men arrived home around Christmas, and they were greeted, the internees, including Traolach, arrived home and they were greeted by large crowds who welcomed them home. But he was again arrested in February 1917 and again deported to England. They were in Bromyard. And on the 9th of June in 1917, Father Augustine married Traolach and Maireann in a local Catholic church. The effectiveness of the GAA, the volunteers, Cumann na mBan, the Gaelic League and Sinn Féin resulted in them being proscribed in 1918 in July of that year. In defiance, 1,500 hurling games were played on the 4th of August in what became known as Gaelic Sunday. Then in the December 1918 elections, Traolach, while captive in Lincoln Prison, is elected TD for Mid-Cork. He is one of 73 pro-independence candidates out of a total of 105. The country is growing in self-assuredness, confidence, and asserting its inalienable sovereignty. By January 1919, the 21st of January, the first Dáil Éireann Assembly takes place in the Mansion House in Dublin. A legitimate government is established. The illegitimate, illegal British government rejects the will of the Irish people. They decide to enforce their illegitimacy through military violence and terrorism. The national and alien government cannot exist side by side, wrote Tom Barry. One has to be destroyed, he said. Traolach is released in March of 1919 and again plunges into work. His comrade Tomás McCurtain is elected Lord Mayor on the 30th of January 1920, and he says, I come to this office more as a soldier than an administrator. One of his first tasks was to pledge the allegiance of Cork City Council to Dáil Éireann, and that proposal was carried. But Tomás was murdered by British government agents in March of that year. Terns succeeds him as Lord Mayor. But Terns is not a careerist politician, nor did he seek the perks of office. In his principles of freedom, the national struggle imperative and its many aspects are clearly defined, and also, as they also are in his inaugural speech, where he states, I come more as a soldier into the breach than as an administrator to the first post in the municipality. He continues, the manner in which our late Lord Mayor was murdered is an attempt to terrify us all. We must show ourselves unterrified, cool and inflexible for the fulfilment of our chief purpose, the establishment of the independence and integrity of our country. To that end I am here. Regarding the example given by Tomás McCurtain, he says, it will be my duty and steady purpose to follow as faithfully as is in my power. He continues, the menace of the enemy hangs over us. Our spirit is but to be a more lively manifestation of the spirit in which we began the year. Inspired by our initial act, when we dedicated it and formally attested our allegiance, to bring by our administration of this city glory to our allegiance, and by working for our city's advancement with constancy in all honourable ways. He announces, we do not abrogate our function to demand and see that evildoers and murderers are punished for their crimes. But our shining hope is that our people are strong. Referring to the adherence of the British regime government, he says, I would address you in one word. You seem to be hypnotised by an evil thing, a usurpation that passes for government. He says, some of you who see no future have been led astray by false prophets. But I ask you to take courage. I do not see these things to hurt you. It seems to me that you have a greater faith in the power of the devil than you have faith in the power of God. You amongst us should improve your position and give an allegiance to your own country. The liberty for which we strive is a sacred thing, he says, inseparably entwined as body and soul with that spiritual liberty for which the Saviour of man died, and which is the inspiration for all just government. Because it is sacred, and death for it is akin to the sacrifice of Calvary, in every generation our best and our bravest have died. No lesser sacrifice could save us. Because of it, our struggle is holy, our battle is sanctified by their blood, and we in turn offer our sacrifices, sustained by the example of our immortal dead and the divine example which inspires us all for the redemption of our country. Referring to the British regime, he says, we must face it and give our attitude simply and clearly. We see in their regime a thing of evil incarnate. With it there can be no parley, any more than there can be a truce with the powers of hell. We will accept no compromise. To the divine author we appeal for strength to sustain us in our battle, that we may bring our people to victory in the end. He worked from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. and planned the most progressive initiatives, including the following: building homes for working people, economic support for Catholics and Republicans who were suffering adverse discrimination in Belfast, an industrial council to maintain peace in industry, a commission to establish a minimum wage, the removal of all public appointments from patronage, support for child welfare, a commission to manage local hospitals, improvement in technical education, etc. He also establishes the Republican courts, whose adjudications are accepted as so just people no longer attend the British courts. Traolach suffered repeated arrests, internments without charge or trial, imprisonments in England and Ireland. He was on hunger strike in 1917. While in Wakefield, England, Muriel says, "Our men were in a terrible state. They were literally starving. Consequently, his health suffered. He only saw his daughter, I think she was about 8 weeks old, when he was serving a prison sentence, when he was held on remand in Belfast." Now in April he is Lord Mayor, and the conflict between the Irish forces, the Irish people, and the IRA on one side and the British on the other intensifies. Despite the fearlessness of the Irish fighters, the lack of weaponry and ammunition severely hampers activities, but they act with determination and conviction and have phenomenal successes. The British swooped on the City Hall on the 20th of August 1920, arrested Terence, brought him before their court. It was a court-martial. He informed them that their court had no function, it was illegal, it had no authority, and that he is the Lord Mayor and Chief Magistrate of Cork City. He went on hunger strike, and then they transported him to Brixton Prison. His family, including Muriel, kept vigil at his bedside during his hunger strike there. And they suffered a torturous time at the hand of the British. The British, including the British administration, behaved barbarically towards them. They did their utmost to belie Terence's hunger strike. When Dr. Griffin, G.B. Griffin, threatened to force juice on Terence, Mary said the threat upset him so much it pushed him towards delirium. She said, "Of all the infamies possible to an individual or government, that of lying about an unconscious victim, who, for the time being, is in their power, is the most vile." Traolach died after 74 days of hunger strike. Muriel, his wife, titled Traolach's profession as an officer in the Irish Republican Army to the coroner. Traolach, shortly before his death, wrote to Comóradh Brua, and he said, "At last, the pain of Easter week is probably dead at last." Traolach's body lay in state in Southwark Cathedral. 30,000 mourners attended. Thousands more marched through the streets. When Traolach died, justifiably the opprobrium of the world fell on England. As the family were bringing Terence's remains home, the British violently stole his body from the funeral party at Holyhead. The family, not wishing to legitimise the kidnapping of Terence, were forced to continue to Dublin without him. Thousands there followed the coffinless hearse. The family finally arrived in Cork and were reunited with his remains. His requiem mass and funeral in the North Cathedral drew vast numbers of mourners, and thousands marched in his funeral to the cemetery. The whole city seemed draped in black. But if only a handful attended, that would not in any way diminish the enormous stature of Terence, Traolach MacSuibhne. He was a patriot, a volunteer soldier in the Irish Defence Forces of our country, a writer, a poet. He was also a son, a brother, a husband, a father, and he possessed all the virtues of a hero. The youngest of the McSweeney's, Sean, described as brilliant, had a successful career in Canada, but returned to Cork during Terence's hunger strike. He was sentenced to 15 years penal servitude in 1921, but escaped from Spike Island by swimming across the harbour. Elected as a TD in 1921, he lost his seat in 22 to an anti-proclamationite. He served imprisonment terms for his Republican activities. Because of his Republican allegiance, employment was shut down to him and he could only get casual work. He died in 1942. His sister Mary was also imprisoned and suffered hunger strike. She, with Annie, started Skull Eata at their home in 1916. It operated from 1916 to 54. Mary undertook a tour of the United States from 1920 to 1921. It was a coast-to-coast tour in an effort to raise support for the Irish Republic. An extremely talented lady, she was a magnificent orator. Under the management of people of Terence's calibre, our nation would be a foremost country in the face of this world. But that is not the case. Our recent history has revealed state corruption, which Terence opposed. This corruption affects the body politic in Ireland to such an extent that a representative of a murder gang offered occupied the Lord Mayor's position in this city. I will not blaspheme this holy place with the name of that person. This country is indebted to the contributions of the McSweeney family, the huge contributions they made to our country. The contributions and sacrifices are of such enormity, they are immeasurable, but they have left us a wonderful, priceless legacy. That is the example of how they lived their lives. Ayeshte Gorabanan Traolach.
I'd like to invite Tomás McCormack to say some words to us on behalf or in regards to Óglach, Seosamh and Murchú, Joe Murphy.
Corja, I'll just start with a poem that Traolach Suibhne wrote in prison shortly after the 1916 rising. It reminds me of a poem that was written by Brian Dillon about another volunteer who died in prison as well, John Lynch from Cork. I walk within my prison wall, 'tis but my body owns their sway. O Ireland home, I hear you call, silent I wait the end of day. And when locked in my cell at night, my body I have laid to rest. My spirit homeward takes a flight, where Ireland waits me in the west. Lit by beauty of the stars, city and mountain, vale and stream, are mine despite these bolts and bars, in all the glory of a dream. It's a privilege to say a few words here at the gravesite of Óglach Joseph of Murchú on the 100th anniversary of his death. Joseph was 25 years of age at the time he embarked upon a hunger strike in 1920. He was born on May 10, 1895 in Lynn, Massachusetts. His parents, Timothy Murphy and Nora O'Brien, both from Cork, had immigrated to the United States, and while Joe was still a young child, they were fortunate enough to be able to return home to Cork, settling what is now known as their family home on Pooladuff Road, Toker. Joe was educated at Toker National School, and upon leaving he took up employment in Cork County Council. He was a dedicated Irish Irelander, playing both hurling and Gaelic football with St. Plunkett's GA club, and was also a keen road bowler, an activity he used to take part in on many Sunday mornings. Joe was an active member of Conran na Gaeilge, which brought him in touch with the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Greater Irish Ireland movement. When the Irish Volunteers set to reorganise in Cork in 1917 with the release of political prisoners, Joseph Murphy joined H Company 2nd Battalion, which later formed part of the 1st Cork Brigade. From his initial involvement, Joe was regarded as a highly trusted and daring member of the Volunteers, and he set about with others in equipping his company with shotguns, rifles, revolvers, and in helping to fundraise for the war that everyone knew would soon materialise. He actively campaigned against conscription, and in 1918 he helped canvass for the election of Terence McSweeney and other Sinn Féin members who went on to establish Dáil Éireann, declaring Ireland independent from England. The 2nd Battalion was one of the most active battalions in Cork, in the Cork area, and were involved in activities that stretched throughout the brigade area. Joseph was involved in several attacks on British police and military posts, including the attack on Farran Police Barracks, which was burned to the ground by the IRA. Murphy was arrested by British forces on the 15th of July 1920 after a raid on his home, and he was imprisoned in Cork Gaol, which is now part of UCC grounds. This was not the first time that Joseph had been within the prison grounds. On the 11th of November 1918, Joseph was involved in the rescue of IRA member Donncha McNeilis from Cork Prison. Having been selected by Sean Haggerty, adjutant to the Cork Brigade, Murphy, along with 5 other volunteers, Martin Donovan, Christy McSweeney, Paddy Healy, Frank McCarthy and Jerome Donovan, entered the prison ground in 3 separate parties under the pretence of visiting various people incarcerated within the jail. Joseph Murphy and Martin Donovan were first to be admitted, where they were brought to the visiting room to meet Donncha McNeilis. and after just a few minutes and making an excuse that they needed to catch a train, Murphy overpowered the guard on duty, knocking him unconscious and set to make the escape of McNeilis. Now in possession of the keys, McNeilis and Donovan calmly walked to the gate room, where the other volunteers had overpowered the guards on duty, and Murphy followed a few minutes later to avoid raising the suspicion of other sentries who were walking throughout the prison grounds. The rescue was executed with absolute military precision, to such a degree that visiting rules were then changed, which made it impossible for a rescue attempt to be properly executed for the release of Michael Fitzgerald and Joseph Murphy during their hunger strike. On the 11th of August, Joe, in conjunction with 60 other Republican prisoners, commenced a hunger strike demanding political status for their immediate release. Rather than concede to all of their demands, the British government released a handful of the prisoners while transferring others to other prison facilities, until only 11 of the 60 remained within Cork jail. During September and October, crowds would gather outside the prison and pray for them daily. After 76 days on hunger strike, a week after the death of Commandant Michael Fitzgerald, Joseph Murphy sadly passed away in the presence of his family. His body was taken from the prison to Loch Chapel, where the volunteers and n-anamacha formed an escort in the presence of thousands of people. On the day of his funeral, there was a strong British military presence who allowed no more than 100 people to follow the hearse on its path to the cemetery here. One encounter the funeral reported, Murphy was given an extraordinary funeral on the 27th of October. The remains of Joseph Murphy were taken from St. Finbarr's Church at 3 o'clock and placed in the hearse in the presence of a dense mass of spectators. Several volunteers carried wreaths, one of which had attached to it an American flag. Just before the start of the announcement was made in the street on a recent occasion by a military officer using a megaphone that not more than 100 people would be allowed to follow the coffin. A number of priests walked at the head of the procession, and immediately behind the hearse came the father, Mr. Timothy Murphy, and his little son. There followed a number of young men, volunteers, and after them a body of girls, members of n-anamacha, wearing mourning bands and many carrying wreaths. A long line of carriages contained relatives and friends. The route, which lay through some of the principal streets of the city, was for the greater part lined by crowds of people. The British military display consisted of 6 lorries containing armed men, some holding revolvers and others rifled, and also 2 armoured cars. The proceedings at the cemetery were regulated by a body of volunteers. When the grave was being closed, poor young Murphy's mother broke down completely and wept aloud. The widow of the late Lord Mayor McCurtain was with some of the members of the Murphy family and did their best to soothe Mrs. Murphy. Her son was interned in what was called the McCurtain Circle in St. Finbarr's Cemetery. Among the chief mourners were his father, Timothy Murphy, his mother, his brother Daniel, and his sisters, May, Anne, and Nora, and his uncles, Richard Murphy and Michael O'Brien. The British military sought to prevent a volunteer military display at the graveside, but without success. As former volunteer Frank Hines remembers, there was an armoured car and some lorries with soldiers at the funeral. We'd secret arrangements made for a firing party at the Republican plot in St. Finbarr's Cemetery. The officer in the armoured car stood at the cemetery gate to see that no shots were fired, but to give him his due, he had his cap in hand during the burial service. We said the rosary and other prayers, delayed as long as we could until the armoured car was gone. Some of the huge crowd departed, thinking all was over, but a great many waited to see if we would have the courage to fire the volley. The IRA commandant came to me and said he thought I should put it off for another time. I said we will wait another bit. Then the officer got into the car and signalled our firing party appeared from nowhere. The car had only started from the gate when the crowd were aroused by hearing the word of command. Firing party, attention. Everyone looked up. I marched the men round the grave and fired the volley, three volleys, and everyone in the crowd clapped. I had a queer feeling listening to the people clapping in the graveyard. After this incident, every young man in the area joined our company. Yesterday, the raibh n-anamacha, Joseph Murphy, rest in eternal peace. Aaron Gabrock.
Gorabila Mahagut, Beg Oran, Ahnoishiv Galera Stolam, a going O Shirley or East, at all Shirley.
In a dreary Brixton prison, where an Irish rebel lay, by his side a priest was standing, ere his soul should pass away. As he faintly murmured, Father, as he clasped him by the hand, tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? Shall my soul pass through old Ireland, and pass through Cork city grand? Shall I see the old cathedral, where St. Patrick took his stand? Shall I see that little chapel, where I pledge my heart and hand? Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? 'Twas for loving dear old Ireland, in this prison cell I lie. 'Twas for loving dear old Ireland, in this foreign land I die. Will you meet my little daughter? Will you make her understand? Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? Shall my soul pass through old Ireland, and pass through Cork city grand? Shall I see the old cathedral, where St. Patrick took his stand? Shall I see that little chapel, where I pledge my heart and hand? Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? With his heart pure as a lily, and his body sanctified, in this dreary British prison, a brave Irish rebel died. Pray the priest his wish be granted, and in blessing raised his hand. Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? Shall my soul pass through old Ireland, and pass through Cork city grand? Shall I see the old cathedral, where St. Patrick took his stand? Shall I see that little chapel, where I pledge my heart and hand? Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland? Tell me this before I die, shall my soul pass through Ireland?
Gormila Mahagat Shirley. Friends, today's event is organised by the Independent National Commemoration Committee, and we have a full programme that people might be interested to join in on. I think it's on a leaflet Eddie has. In fact, there is some literature available. Eddie, do you want to wave your hand there, people can see, including a new little booklet published on the situation in Cork in 1920. I think it's available for €5 or whatever people might be able to contribute, which presents a unique view of 1920 Cork on the question of the Government of Ireland Act, which was the Partition Act and so on. So people can get that, but then also see details of the programme of Centenary commemorations, which we are continuing and will continue over the coming years. So chorde Gormila Mahagat as a Velinganu, Iram Orav, Seosamh Lynn, agus Seosamh le pobl na Héireann, agus na hiarachtaí a Harbun, chun an phoblacht a fógraíoch an éidir go séideag, a thug na hóglaigh son a bheithaigh, chun é sin a chur a Grieg. Baramagiv. And a special thanks to the Cork Brigade Reenactment Group volunteers who joined us today. Go to Mahagif, lads.